understand it and appreciate the capacities that the currency issuing government has, or what will happen if a government restricts its currency issuing capacity, such as in the Eurozone. And so MMT is just this, what I would think to be a superior lens to understanding the way the system actually operates and the opportunities that the system presents a government. But that only takes you so far. And to give that traction or make that useful, you then have to impose a value system on top of that understanding. You know, what are your values? What's your worldview? And depending upon, and another way of saying that is that a right winger, you know, a so-called neoliberal could Lower straightforward mainstream economics nonsense. It's fake knowledge, but they reiterated their public statements and say
And they say, well, how do I pay it? And I said, well, you need to, I've got the currency, I'm the government, you've got to pay me $10. And they look at me and they say, well, where am I going to get it from? And that's the first learning experience. They say, okay, well, I'll hire you for $20 an hour. And I said, $10. I've got the currency. And let's do an hour's work. And they look at me on something. They say, okay, we're playing a mind game. And that's the first learning experience. They immediately understand that I have to spend that currency before they can pay me back in tax. $10. So, and let's do an hour's Logic 101 then principle is that something that causes something can't come after it. It's got to come before it. They immediately understand. And so therefore the taxes can't cause the spending. They can pay me back in tax. So it's got to, the spending causes the taxation capacity. Something that causes. And so you can take that example further, and then I asked them, well, have you been able to save any of my currency? So therefore taxes only paid you for 10 and you paid me 10, they immediately understand they haven't been able to save anything. Taxation. So we've got the next principle, and I say to them, well, I've spent 10 and got back 10. If I run a deficit or a surplus, they immediately understand that I've run a balance. And so their principle number 2. Principle number 1 was that taxes can't cause spending. Principle number 2 is that the government balance is a dollar for dollar equal to the non-government balance. We've both run balances. And then the next part of the little game, I tell them, okay, I'll give you $20 this time, but I only tax you 10. So we get the second principle, that a deficit, and then they realize that they've got $10 spare in this little game that they didn't have to pay in taxes because I've given them 20 and done some work advancing well-being. And they immediately get the second principle, or reinforce that second principle, that my deficit is a source of their, and they understand this $10 is now wealth to them. It's a store of wealth. So you build up, that's a very simple way of talking. It's like talking to children, but it's relearning things. We have to start by relearning things that are so ingrained in us. I was at a function on Saturday evening, and these were all very educated, progressive people. And and the sort of things that some of them were saying about government spending being inflationary, governments running out of money, just mind-boggling. And so when you have that level of ingrained fake knowledge, you have to start simple by going back to primary school. And it's not an insult, it's just we learnt language in an elementary way. We learnt concepts in a very elementary way, and we have to go back to primary school. And that's the way I sort of approach it, in a respectful way, but that's the way I do it. And the language we use is very important, as you say. And I'm just learning this myself and trying to language we use this myself. As you say, I now no longer use the word budget deficit to describe the fiscal balance of a currency issuing government, because that immediately invokes the frame that the government budget is somehow like a household budget, which is one of the primary organising tools of the mainstream to invoke those ideas that the government, our experience as households, is somehow meaningful in understanding the experience of government, which is clearly not. And so I avoid using that term budget. And there's a whole lot of other, I'm moving towards other things. I mean, maybe if we stop using government spending, because spent means exhaustion and nothing left. And maybe we should just use terms like government investment, which means expanding our fortunes rather than spending them off. And so I'm learning those things myself, but it's a real challenge and it's an ongoing journey.
So it's interesting because, you know, whenever Dr. Kelton or yourself or Warren or, you know, any of the other headliners in this movement go out there and they do some form of a tweet, it's instantly memorialized into almost a meme, because these short, concise answers do more for us, even if it's just to open the conversation. You know, the article that Stephanie wrote for both the LA Times and the New York Times were like manna from heaven for those of us who are out there on the front line swinging away. Anytime one of these well-written, easy to consume articles comes out, it just gives us, you know, a full 5-course meal of information to dole out to others. You wrote a textbook as well, and I think this is a good transition here. You wrote the very first textbook that was purely from an MMT perspective. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important here? What went into it, and what we should be a textbook that was purely from an MMT perspective. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Just a comment on your use of social media. I think social media has been the vehicle for us taking our academic ideas into the domain. Just a comment on your use of social media. I think social media has been the vehicle for us taking our academic ideas. We're increasingly learning that. I mean, we're not just a comment on your researchers and teachers, and our communication skills were developed in a specific context. And so we have to learn all of these new ways of communicating and getting messages across. But I think when I started my blog, which was in 2004, it was an early adoption of the technique, pre-Twitter, pre all of those other things. It started to bring our academic work into the main public debate, and I think people like Stephanie are very good at Twitter. I'm less good at Twitter because I'm too verbose, but I'm learning, and I think those things are really good. And it is definitely building the network and bringing together people from my side of the world, like academics, into bringing together with people like you who are advocates and activists, and that twain has to meet and strengthen, and on the progressive side, and that's a great thing. In terms of the textbook, we've already got an introductory textbook out that we put out earlier for a teaching program at my university. But now we've completed the manuscript for the next version, which is a 2-year university sequence in explicitly written in an unapologetic manner from an MMT perspective. It's from Randy Ray, myself, and Martin Watts. Macmillan will be publishing that. They're the largest textbook publishers in the world. They're publishing that in April 2018. And the fact that Macmillan has taken it up is an extremely significant move in my view, because, as I said, they're the largest textbook publisher in the world. They're a commercial publisher, and they won't publish anything they can't make a buck on, or think they can make a buck on. Whether they do is another question, but they've obviously assessed that, and our approach is unapologetic. I mean, it's not a sort of a mainstream book with a bit of MMT in it. It's front and centre MMT. We don't adopt the view of where we trot out the neoliberal or the mainstream macroeconomics and then have a critique of it. We largely avoid that approach, and there are certain elements of mainstream macroeconomics in there, mostly as his history of economic thought, to make sure that our students understand the context in which we're writing, rather than leave them devoid of any historical understanding of where my profession has gone. But it's front and center MMT. It's a university level text, but as I announced at the UMKC conference a few weeks ago, we're starting what we're calling an MMT university, and this will be a an institution, an online institution that will provide educational courses in modern monetary theory. Students will, some of those courses will be based upon the textbook. So they'll provide university level education for those that wish to engage at that level. But we'll also be providing other courses which we might call, and with respect, primary school MMT courses. So very, very introductory courses. Some of them will be just short courses, but they'll be short. They'll be at a level which will allow people to progress intellectually up to the university level courses, even if they've never had a university or college in your context education. And so I think that that's going to help us expand the informed populace, because one of the problems is that we don't want MMT to become a sort of popularized story where corners are cut on what's correct, what are correct statements and what are not. So we've been talking about a quality assurance framework to make sure that when people are saying they are representing MMT, then what they're doing is really advancing the ideas and not involving themselves in fictions. And so the MMT University will be a vehicle to engage with those who want the most basic introduction through to those who want to have a university level. Now, it's not going to offer awards at this stage, but I'm hoping over time we'll be able to articulate formal arrangements with existing university programs where they credit students who have done the MMT courses with credits within a formal university program elsewhere.
Very good. So one of the questions that I think comes up nearly all the time is inflation, the concerns of inflation, traditional sources of inflation. Typically the word printing money comes up. We realize that that's not really the case. The real case has to do with resources and the availability of resources on demand. Can you talk a little bit, if you were presenting to a government that was really taking a serious consideration of MMT, how they might view the role of resources, inflation, and spending, that relationship there? Could you frame that for us?
If I can, it's often stated by critics of MMT, and what's happening over the last year or maybe 2 years is that the number of critics is growing, and I think that's a great thing, because that means that the period in which people just ignored us is over. And when you've got people criticising you, it means that they're seeing it as a threat to their own particular worldview. So I think that's good. But one of the things that they, short put downs is, MMTs think that fiscal deficits are unlimited, and that there's no constraint on the size of a fiscal deficit that a government can run. And they say that because they then invoke all of this stuff about inflation and running out of money and all of that. Now, it's totally false. None of the main MMT academics have ever said anything remotely like that fiscal deficits are unlimited. What we say, or what I say, is that a currency issuing government can buy whatever is for sale in its own currency, and that's the limit. And when you think about it like that, there's no financial constraint on governments doing that, because that government issues its own currency. But what the constraint that the government that issues its own currency faces is a real resource constraint, as you pointed out. And real resources are capital and labour and land and the things that go into production. And if a government desires, has the political will, it can ensure that all idle productive resources are brought back into productive use in one form or another. But it can't do more than that. And if it tries to spend beyond the amount of spending that's required to bring those resources back into production, then of course it's going to be adding inflationary pressures. And so the inflation constraint is the available real resources that can be purchased with the government's currency. And so that tells you what the limit on the fiscal deficit should be if the non-government sector desires to run a surplus. And that is that the government deficit should be such that it makes sure that all idle resources are productively engaged. Not a dollar more than that. And most people say, oh yeah, but if you keep doing that, you'll just eventually get inflation. Well, no, you won't. Because what we know is that population sizes grow and productivity grows. And so the capacity of the real side of the economy, the productive side of the economy, is growing as well. And so that creates an imperative that spending in the economy grows in proportion with that. Because if the productive side, the supply side of the economy is growing, then the demand side has to follow it. Otherwise, you'll get insufficient spending in the economy and a lack of, you'll get unemployment and recession. And so the government can run continuous deficits, and its spending can, in nominal terms, dollar terms, increase continuously without there being inflation, as long as they're sitting within that inflation constraint I mentioned. Now, then the Conservatives wheel out, well, they used to wheel out the Weimar Republic, but now they've become more modern, and they talk about Zimbabwe. Now, the only relevant thing about Zimbabwe was it was a great song that Bob Marley wrote and sang. But the relevance for inflation, relevant and fiscal deficit was virtually zero. Bob Marley, and the reason I say that is because, as I've explained, in the relevance for inflation, relevant and hyperinflation at virtually zero. Bob Marley, and the reason I say that is because it was due to policies introduced by Robert Mugabe to reward his freedom fighters who broke the colonial yoke, and he awarded freedom fighters who were good at shooting up things. He awarded them, gave them land control of farms. Now, the two problems emerged was the farming in Zimbabwe was among the most productive in the world. It was held by whites, owned by whites. And the freedom fighters that took over those farms were not farmers. They were freedom fighters. And so what happened was that productivity and output in Zimbabwe collapsed by up to 60% very quickly. And if you've got a supply contraction of that size, then you'll get hyperinflation almost immediately. And cutting the fiscal deficit wouldn't have helped at all, because just the non-government spending would have driven the hyperinflation. And so when you have a massive supply contraction, same story in Weimar Republic in the 1920s, by the way. When you have a massive supply side contraction, you're going to get hyperinflation. It tells you nothing about ongoing fiscal deficits in a normal economy that's mostly found.
Very good. All right. So my final question, which is going to kind of build on that, goes to the fact that you were the dare I say, the father of the job guarantee, in terms of you had talked about the buffer stock for agriculture in Australia. And this is from a conversation you and I had offline. So my question to you is, given that we talk about Weimar and hyperinflations and all these other not, silly things that are oftentimes brought up to us to kind of slow us down, so to speak. The job guarantee is something that I think is of incredible importance, especially to minorities in the United States who are trapped in areas that are not only not serving their needs, but are leaving them behind. And I'm going to use some terminologies from Ellis Winningham, who usually is on with me. He basically said that the job guarantee allows mobility, which these affected communities never experienced before. Suddenly they can pick up and go wherever they want and have a job the next day, as it is their right to do so, with fringe benefits, etc. This is an incredibly empowering tool for the 99%, which in my opinion is the beginning of flipping neoliberalism on its head. Can you talk a little bit about the job guarantee, its impact on minority communities, and overall why it is so key to understanding MMT?
Well, hopefully I can. I'm not sure I'd call myself the father. I wouldn't call myself the father of job guarantee. Clearly, in this modern era, the terminology, I reintroduced that terminology. Others have talked about this in earlier periods, both the term and the concept. What I think, and Warren and I came to this separately. Warren Mosler had a concept called employer of last resort, and I had a concept called buffer stock employment, BSE. And the reason I changed from BSE to job guarantee was because Britain was enduring the mad cow disease, if you remember, which was called BSE, and I thought that we better not have the job guarantee policy being related to mad cows. But I came on, the idea that I had came about when I was a university student in late 1970s, 1978 to be explicit. And it was in relation to the wool price stabilisation scheme that the Australian government ran. And this was briefly a scheme where they agreed to stabilise prices for farmers so that farm incomes wouldn't have those ups and downs, seasonal ups and downs, and so farmers could plan their lives better. And so whenever the wool clip, the production of wool each year was above amount to stabilise that price, if there was too much wool, the government would agree to buy it all, the surplus. And if the wool clip was deficient, so prices would rise, the government sold the wool clip out of its buffer stocks that it held in big red brick buildings all around Australia. And so I wasn't so much interested in the wool industry at the time I was studying agricultural economics. I was more interested in employment of labour. And it was at a time when unemployment was starting to rise in the late 70s, as it did everywhere. And so I thought that this was a full employment of wool, of labour plan, that the government could buy all the surplus labour that the private sector didn't want, and then at a fixed price, and then stabilise the price, and then release it back into the private sector if and when the private sector was bidding it away and was strong enough to give it work and pay it above that fixed price, which would effectively become the minimum wage. And that's how I got the idea of job guarantee. Warren came through it in a different way, but it's become a centrepiece of what we now call modern monetary theory. And without being too geeky, there's been a major debate in macroeconomics over the years called the Phillips curve debate. And this is the so-called relationship between unemployment and inflation. So Keynesians believe, believed that there was a trade-off, that if you wanted to have less unemployment, you had to tolerate more inflation, and so governments had to make that choice. Monetarists came along and said there was no real trade-off, that there was only one unemployment rate that the market would fix at, which would be consistent with stable inflation, and you had to tolerate that no matter what level. And if it was too high, governments could do nothing about it other than structural change, which really meant deregulation and training and those type of things, the neoliberal era. And what the job guarantee idea does for the Phillips curve debate is it basically renders it irrelevant, because what it shows is that the government can have true full employment with stable inflation by paying a fixed price to any labour unconditionally, to any labour that is not working. And the reason that it's that it basically voids the so-called trade-off between unemployment and inflation is that the government, when it's offering a fixed price, is offering it to anybody who's currently has no bid in the private market. What I mean by that is that the private market doesn't want this resource. They're not prepared to pay a cent for them. That's why they're unemployed. And so the government is not competing with the private sector for any market resource at all. They're buying labour that the market doesn't want. And so that can't be inflationary. And so this I saw this as a very important step in the development of macroeconomic policy and understanding that you no longer had to accept that there was a trade-off or no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. You could have price stability and full employment both together. And how that, to me, that's a very empowering thing for communities, because it recognises that the state has a responsibility for full employment, that that any unemployment is then a political choice, and then citizens have to demand, well, what the hell are you doing if you're just making this political choice? Whose politics are you serving? But moreover, it recognises that the state chooses the unemployment rate and can choose a very low unemployment rate if it desires, and we force it to, as through citizens' action. And the major cause of poverty and dislocation is unemployment. And the job guarantee, as you said, is an empowering policy framework. It gives income security. It's a framework that it could incorporate skill development. It's a framework that can incorporate inclusion of minorities that don't find themselves able to work, and I'm thinking people with disabilities that private sector will never employ, and so the public sector has a flexible framework that can employ people with adequate clinical support as well as the job. It's a regionally specific program, as you mentioned, that it's not a generalised expansion. It provides jobs wherever people are, so it reinforces what I call the economic, the social settlement where people live. It brings the economic settlement where jobs are to where people live, and stops this sort of bleeding of regional areas where there's no industry anymore. And it can also be used as a really powerful force to meet unmet community and environmental needs. And I think it's a really evolutionary framework, which is why I can't understand why progressives have increasingly opted to support basic income guarantees. But I think that's another topic of conversation for us.
Indeed it is. In fact, that really would be a long conversation right there. So, Dr. Mitchell, I want to thank you. We're at the hour right now. I would love to be able to have you come back on again. You're clearly one of my favorite people. So your time's been very, very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Do you have anything further that you'd like to bring up that's coming up here? I know that you've been traveling quite extensively in support of your book. Is there anything else coming up here that the audience might be of interest?
Look, just follow my blog. You'll see where I am at. I'm sort of all over the place. So, I think my next trip's back to Italy in December. We're talking to some major progressive politicians and helping them reframe their policy debates. So we'll see what happens. But just keep an eye on my blog, on my tweets, and I hope we can talk a bit more later.
Absolutely. Wouldn't have it any other way. All right, folks. Everyone say thank you so much to Dr. Bill Mitchell. Dr. Bill Mitchell, thank you again from Real Progressives. You've been most gracious with your time. Tell your lovely wife we said thank you for letting us borrow you. And we'll talk to you soon.
I'm borrowing her Facebook account.
Yes, you are. All right, so we will talk to you soon. Thank you so much again. Have a great night.
Take care. See you later.
Yeah.